Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this bright blue Ludgate Lecture, named after our original office in Ludgate Circus in central London. And these Ludgate Lectures invite prominent thinkers, decision makers to come and speak to us, to challenge us, to inform us, to inspire us. And I'm delighted today that we have Adrian Wooldridge, who is currently the global business columnist at Bloomberg Opinion and previously a columnist for The Economist. And he has just brought out yet another book. He's probably one of the most productive people that I know in terms of publishing books. And it's called Centrists of the World Unite, and the Lost Genius of Liberalism. So certainly up Bright Blue's street. Just to say, we obviously want to amplify some of the arguments coming from this lecture today. So if you're using X, please use the hashtag #BrightBlue to kind of comment on some of the things coming from today's lecture. And just to say also, you'll have your chance to put your questions to Adrian in the Slido link, which is below the YouTube video that you're watching at the moment. So just tell us who you are and what your question is. And I'll be sure to ask that question to Adrian directly, because one of the Bright Blue technical team will send it through to me. So really, Adrian's new book explores, well, it's a solid defense of liberalism and how it's shaped the West for the better. But it talks really about how there have been moments of retreat and then reflection by liberals to then re-emerge and be stronger. And really why they are centrists is because of that adaptation and that ability to dominate politics and take on the extremes from both the left and the right. But of course, liberalism seems to be again in a period of being under threat, particularly in the UK, where the sort of mainstream centre-left and centre-right party seem to be really being outdone by the more populist Reform UK and Green Party. But there are examples overseas where centrists have re-emerged and seem to be stronger. Carney in Canada, for example, Merz in Germany. So, you know, worldwide in the developed, in particularly in the developed world, populists have been on the march, but there have been examples where they have took on where centrists have took them on and won, most recently also in the Netherlands. So there is hope, but what can the UK learn in particular? That's something we hope Adrian maybe explore. And Adrian talks about in his book the sort of three types of liberalism that we have got today, which have kind of alienated the white working class, who have sort of been more attracted to populist votes. He talks about neoliberals worshipping the markets, left liberals worshipping marginalized groups, and managerial liberals worshipping global bureaucracies, and them all creating a distance from the white working class. Bright blue is that liberalism has tended to sort of focus and lean in and become associated with identity politics and identitarianism, rather than the kind of communitarian tradition, that sense of belonging and unity and national pride, which we feel it should lean into more to revive itself. We also think that it's become very associated with the status quo and the establishment, where it needs to, again, refined its radicalism and its policies for change. So do look out for a new essay collection that we're publishing later this month, where we'll have lots of new ideas on a more radical liberal agenda. So Adrian's going to speak for about 20 minutes. I'm then going to have a bit of a Q&A, and then it's over to questions from you. So Adrian, we're delighted to have you. Over to you.
Well, I'm delighted to be here, and thank you very much for that very flattering and informative introduction. And I really look forward to that collection of essays. I hope it will solve some of the problems that I've been worried about for some time. But I do think that liberalism, centrism, is in the biggest trouble that it has been in since the 1930s. And I don't use the comparison with the 1930s lightly, because one shouldn't do so. But I think at the moment we have an axis of autocracy which is extremely aggressive, which wants to replace the liberal order with a very different sort of order, which is openly contemptuous of liberal values and liberal systems of government, and which is, I suspect, much stronger than even our military strategists think that it is. We've seen how powerful Iran is against the preconceptions of both the United States and Israel. And I think that's probably true of China and probably true of Russia as well. These are highly militarized societies which have invested a great deal of money in the military and have a very aggressive posture and have a population that is set to be aggressive towards us. And we are, in our very different cultures, pretty decadent about these sorts of things. So I think they start off with an advantage. But the biggest problem with liberalism comes from within. We have the rise of democratic strongmen. These are people who operate within democratic systems but do not value the restraints on power, which is identified with liberalism. Most obviously, Donald Trump, who I think doesn't have a liberal bone in his body. He's a pure populist. He believes in the virtues of the people, his people, and that any constraint on his power is illegitimate. He said as much to the New York Times. We also have Modi, who is in the process of transforming India from a multicultural constitutional state as much as possible into an ethno state, a Hindu ethno state run by him and his party. Again, very, very liberal. We have the situation of Orban in Hungary talking openly about illiberal democracy. So that's a problem within. But we have the rise of populism. It seems that, and the polarization that comes from populism. It seems that all of the emotional energy is coming now from the extremes of politics. A lot of the intellectual energy, particularly in the United States, is coming from the extremes of politics. And as we saw in the recent Gordon Denton by-election, the middle was just obliterated. The Tories lost their deposit, the Labour Party lost a seat that it's held since 1931, and everybody went to the Greens, who won handily, and to a lesser extent to Reform. And this is something Piketty did a very good article on, the crisis of social democracy across the world, and he showed that the centre has repeatedly been destroyed across the world over the issue of immigration, which has divided the sort of the cognitive knowledge elite, the service professional classes from the white working classes, and split that social democratic tradition down the middle. So we have polarization, we have an external threat, we have strongmen, but we also have something even worse than that, I think, and that is that the liberal elite has become an elite. It's become a ruling class that's inheriting its positions, that's been in power for too long, and has begun to demonstrate most of the evils of established ruling classes. One of the things that I found when I was writing this book is that I was looking at the rise of liberalism when liberalism was a fresh, new, radical ideology or set of political theories, and the sort of phrases that the liberals like John Stuart Mill were applying to the establishment apply perfectly to the liberal establishment today. They have become the very thing that they sought to unseat. And I think that's a problem in terms of liberalism's appearance, in terms of its capacity to respond to problems. But even deeper than this incrustation of power and privilege and position is a new form of ideological laziness, that from about 1980 onwards, a new form of liberalism, a new liberal consensus emerged. This was Thatcherism. The market should prevail, all else being equal. The state should be shrunk. Business is a good thing. And later along comes Blair and combines this economic liberalism with social liberalism. A lot of it culled from the prejudices of the 1960s, and creates this new consensus, which I would call bourgeois bohemian liberalism, bobo liberalism, and which is all united by the idea that individuals should be left to pursue their ends in their own sort of ways, and interference should be done very, very reluctantly, and it certainly shouldn't have a moral hortatory scolding element. We should never tell people that they're doing things that are harming them themselves. So this establishment, armed with this doctrine of Bobo liberalism, is the ruling class at the moment. And that Bobo liberalism did lots and lots of great, wonderful things. Gay marriage and all of that liberated lots of people from oppression and anxiety and marginal lives. The Thatcherite economic revolution took a basket case, stagnant sort of economic world and injected some new dynamism. But all political theories, all ideologies, when they put into practice, begin to become inert. And I think one of the things that's happened is the problems being created by this particular synthesis are becoming bigger, and we are failing to respond to those problems. So the neoliberal, social liberal synthesis most obviously is manifested in great enthusiasm for immigration, which is regarded as culturally a good thing, economically a good thing. We don't see any of the downsides. Well, is it right not to be thinking more seriously about the downsides? We have the issue of drug liberalization or legalization. This is a good thing, let people do their own things. Well, is this really a good idea when a lot of these drugs are so powerful and so addictive? Gambling, legalization, is that such a good thing to mainstream gambling, sports betting, and the rest of it? Have gambling joints on every high street when the addictive qualities of these things, and most important of all, the capitalist platform companies, the tech companies, which are, I think, fragmenting our attention, which are using algorithms deliberately to create addiction, and which are in some ways deliberately spreading misinformation. Is it good always to celebrate business when some of those businesses are undermining, I think, some of the core tenets of liberal democracy? So I think that the economic liberalism and social liberalism synthesis needs to be rethought. Where do we go? How can, as the title of this lecture suggests, how can centrists deal with these current problems, and how can they change and win? I think the most important thing they need to do is rethink the core of liberalism. They need to distinguish between the essential parts of liberalism and the incidental parts of liberalism. I think the Bobo synthesis is incidental. It's one possible manifestation of liberalism, but it isn't all that liberalism has to offer. The core elements of liberalism are the following: individualism, a focus on the individual. Liberal societies start with the individual and work upwards rather than the other way around. But that isn't just the individualism of shopping, as it tended to become under Thatcher and under the neoconservatives. It isn't just the consumer making choices to maximize his utility or her utility. It's something more than that. It should include notions of self-restraint, self-development, self-education, self-improvement, what the Germans call Bildung, which is the sort of creation of the cultivated individual. So we should be more concerned with the sort of preferences that people have, in educating those preferences, in helping people not to make bad choices, and encouraging them to make good choices. In other words, this is a notion of individualism that I'm expressing, which is much more judgmental, and I'm happy to say that, much more judgmental than the neoliberals would be happy with. The second basic element of liberalism is toleration of diverse beliefs. It's based on the idea that we don't know the ultimate truth. We certainly don't know the ultimate truth when it comes to theological issues, and we have no right to impose orthodoxies on people's opinions. And again, this might sound quite banal, but this is being eaten away at in some of our core institutions. In the way that universities work, you have, I think, a fashion for shouting people down. In the way that some of the parallel Muslim communities work in our country, you're basically imposing. Cultures are imposing faith. We have the case of the head of the teacher at Batley Grammar School, who's driven into he's disappeared basically because he questions certain religious orthodoxies about showing images of Muhammad. And finally, the division of powers. Liberalism is based on the division of powers, on the belief that power is an inherently dangerous, corrupting, destructive thing that needs to be constrained in all sorts of ways. And again, we have within democratic societies that's fundamental insight being challenged and overthrown by Trump, by Modi, by Orban, and by others. So we need to reassert these fundamental liberal principles and rethink them in some way. And finally, the other fundamental liberal principle is a certain degree of flexibility, a certain willingness to say that we should be led by problems, not by ideologies, that we should change the mix of ideas that we have to deal with new problems. I would add to that we need to be so rethink. And to this, I would say particularly important is a willingness to rethink some of our sort of neoliberal assumptions that business is always good, that we should always give business the benefit of the doubt. I think that is often true. I think but not true in the case of companies that get us addicted to ultra processed food, which makes us fat. I think the obesity epidemic is huge. Not true in terms of gambling companies that depend on addiction, and definitely not true on the IT companies. We need to be more judgmental, more willing to restrict their capacity to do what they will. Secondly, I would say so we need to rethink. I think congruent with that is that we need to regroup. That the sort of alliances that we've made and that worked very well over the last 40 years of liberalism will need to be rethought in certain ways. I think we need to move in some ways to the right. I think we need to be much more friendly to certain cultural conservatives who are judgmental, who believe that there are certain great cultural traditions that need to be transmitted, and who are worried about the degradation of our culture. And I would give as an example of this, liberals, neoliberals, left liberals, as a group were very dismissive of Roger Scruton as a sort of terrible reactionary and all fuddy-duddy. But what he said, let's say, about pornography, turns out to be absolutely right. The pornographication of our culture, the mass dissemination of pornography by these platforms, the fact that the OnlyFans person who I saw just died was one of the few billionaires that British business has created in the past few years, should be deeply worrying. Roger Scruton was right about that. We should have been listening to him, as he was right about drugs, in my opinion. On the other hand, we need to form certain alliances with the left. And particularly, I think the left has been right to worry about giant companies, about economic concentration, and has been right to worry about the power of these digital companies. So we need to abandon some of our, an instinctive support for the CBI needs to be replaced by much more distance with some of the business communities and much more willingness to criticize business. And finally, in terms of this regrouping, we need to find a new generation of people. I'm not sure that people who grew up during the great era of neoliberalism and social liberalism are the right people to be questioning what's going on. What we see with somebody like Starmer, who sort of is in an intellectual nowhere land, is paralysis. So you either have people who are reiterating dying ideas, or you have people who are paralyzed, who don't really have an idea. We need a new generation of people who rethink liberalism and who are willing to challenge the status quo. Because if we don't have the center challenging the status quo, it'll come from the right or the left. The centre needs to be willing to be a radical movement. As liberalism, as I demonstrate in my book at some length, as liberalism has always been at its best when it's radical. And finally, I think rethink, regroup, and then re-articulate. One of the things that we see with liberalism, particularly let's say in the corporate world, corporate liberalism, is its dead language. It's completely uncompelling because it uses slogans, it uses phrases, it uses DEI, transparency, accountability, all of these things which don't really mean anything because the people who are using them don't really believe them. They're just bureaucrats enunciating phrases. Now, this is a big mixture. Rethink, regroup, rearticulate. But if you look at the history of liberalism, it has always been able, just as you think it's dying, as many think liberalism is dying now, it has risen from its coffin and regenerated itself, and it's regenerated itself through these mechanisms. In the 1890s, liberalism became a series of phrases about the wonders of the free market, articulated by a very complacent establishment. Lord Rosebery, the Liberal Prime Minister, didn't even ever fight an election. He did have a horse that won the Grand National, but he never fought an election. And by the early 20th century, you have a new group of new liberals who say we must have a new balance between the individual and the states. We must help the individual to achieve their ends through investment in education or health services and things like that. Not because we're collectivists, but because we believe that the individual needs to be freed to express their or achieve their abilities. And once you have this intellectual revolution, this transition from laissez-faire to new liberalism, suddenly you have Lloyd George, you have Churchill, you have Asquith, you have a new lot of talent, and you have a new legislative agenda which sweeps forward. Again, the 1930s, everybody thought liberalism was dead. It was pronounced to be a redundant ideology. And by the 40s and 50s, the liberals are laying the foundations of the new world order, new welfare state, new economic model. Again, in the 1970s, we had this terrible period of stagflation, inertia, an old, corrupt sort of trade union dominated establishment, and the neoconservatives come along with new ideas addressed to the relevant problems of the time and regenerate liberalism. I think we're in this position now that we need to have a new version of liberalism to address a new set of problems. And if we can get these ideas right, then issues such as talent, issues such as party organization will take care of themselves. Once we get the blueprint, the bright blue blueprint ready, then everything else will follow. So I'm simultaneously extraordinarily depressed about the news, about what's happening in the world. As I said, the 1930s hangs very heavily over us, but very optimistic that liberalism has always managed to cheat death at the last moment and regenerate itself. Thank you.
Great, brilliant. Thank you, Adrian. Very comprehensive and inspiring stuff there. And a lot of the things you say resonate certainly with Bright Blue and match with the principles that we try to articulate, being pro-market, not free market, believing strongly in meritocracy. So I've got some questions and some challenges. So my first question is, what's the real problem? Who are the real problem? Is it the liberals who are overreaching? So, for example, you've seen recently with decriminalizing abortion from 24 weeks
Yes.
up to birth.
Insanity. Yeah.
That could be seen as a liberal overreach, as was this idea of self-identification of trans. So, is it that liberals have gone too far, or is it the internal liberal critics who are sort of demonizing and distorting liberalism, saying it's all about, it's sort of excessive individualism? When, people like Isaiah Berlin will say, well, liberty is the paramount principle, but liberals should also believe in these other desirable ends as well. It's just that the individual freedom should be paramount, and that markets, kind of worshipping of markets in neoliberalism, that we've had that, but actually we've got the highest rates of taxation, the highest levels of borrowing, the highest levels of state spending. We've had lots of regulation. People complain that we're overly regulated, particularly in terms of helping new AI companies. We've obviously had a massive increase in the minimum wage, now the highest in Europe. So my question really I know I've sort of made that quite a long question, but to distill it is the main problem liberal overreach, or the critics, the internal critics, actually distorting what liberalism is doing or has achieved?
A difficult set of questions. I think one of the things that's gone wrong with liberalism or centrism is that it's lost a sort of feel for pragmatism, for pragmatic compromise. That's, you would have thought a defining characteristic of liberalism is a willingness to negotiate, to talk, to compromise. That's why you're in the center. You're trying to take things and compromise. You're not an ideologue. But what liberalism has become during the last 40 years is a sort of synthesis of extreme ideas. So the neoliberals have quite an extreme view of the efficiency of markets, or certainly their most prominent intellectual exponents do. The sort of global managerial class has quite an extreme view of the proper relationship between managers and democracies. They want to have as much as possible done by a sort of managerial elite. And that's particularly true of human rights lawyers, I think, who are very extreme in their attitude to nation states and the people. They believe in this sort of Platonic set of rules which should be applied everywhere. And I think also social liberals have become quite extreme, obviously in the self-ID thing, but this abortion law, it was, what was the point of doing it, really, apart from to declare an absolute belief and an absolute principle. And whatever you think of abortion, when it's taken to the extreme that it was taken to in that legislation, it becomes something that's morally abhorrent. What was the point of doing that? You are in the grip of an idea and an ideology, and I think that was true of a lot of the notion of freedom to choose has become, both on the abortion side and on the neoliberal side, has become quite an extreme version of individualism. So what you have is a middle ground, which isn't a common ground. A middle ground is the sort of area where extremists can agree on certain things. They become an army of extremists who, so the neoliberals agree to go along with the abortion thing because they get their wider thing done. And I think the element of common sense, of judgment, has been removed there. And I think we need to reassert that, or reassert a sort of balance. And it is, in many, many ways, what you have is an extreme individualism, the notion that the individual is a pleasure-seeking, utility-maximizing entity, which should never be constrained in doing that. I can't think of any other reason that you would come up with those extraordinary arguments about late-term abortion and things like that. It's taking the freedom of the individual to choose to an extraordinary length.
So just on that point
Yeah.
around extreme individualism, because that's a criticism of liberals that often comes
Yes.
from the right,
Yes.
and I sympathize with your argument about making allies with cultural conservatives on values such as self-restraint and
Yeah.
discipline and self-improvement. I agree with that a lot. And you cite Michael Sandel quite a lot, who's a very big communitarian thinker. And quite rightly, I think, says actually the sort of liberal elite that we have now feels that they are a product of meritocracy. So whereas in the past, you were the elite because the aristocracy was no one had any agency over it. You were just born into it. Whereas now there's a sense of, well, I deserve this.
Yes.
And therefore the result is that people who haven't got as much, living on more modest incomes, feel that they deserve that lower status. And that may have caused a bit of a backlash. So goes
absolutely.
And that's compelling to a certain point. But what I would say is that liberalism does have a rich communitarian tradition.
Absolutely.
It doesn't completely ignore belonging and tradition. And Isaiah Berlin in particular was like that. And really the fundamental point, and why I think liberals and communitarians should align more and not be seen in conflict, is because if people are genuinely free and we are social animals, then they would pursue belonging. They would pursue that make them happy. So I'm a bit, I'm irritated by this sort of liberals and communitarians going against one another when actually they should be good allies, and that would be very helpful for centrist politics, I think.
Absolutely, no, absolutely. I completely agree, and I do think that the benefits of meritocracy outweigh the criticisms that Sandel is making. But I think the idea that you have an elite that is both extremely talented, extremely rich, and extremely self-satisfied is not good for society or for anybody. But the communitarian thing, I think that the question is, what do you mean by individualism? And the neoliberal view of individualism, which is a Benthamite view or a utilitarian view, is of the pleasure-seeking, utility-maximizing atom. And I don't think that is all there is to liberalism by a very long way. Somebody once said that a liberal is somebody who can have an argument with themselves. And it always strikes me that most of the best criticisms of liberalism have been made by liberals. I mean, the greatest critic of individualism is Tocqueville, a great liberal French thinker. And I think that when we're talking about individualism, I think it's important. Again, if you go back to John Stuart Mill, who's often cited by the Hayek style people as a sort of classical liberal individualist who believes that you shouldn't be allowed to interfere with my right to swing my fist starts where your nose starts, but there's nothing else that does that. And I don't think that's what Mill is saying. Mill, in on liberty and in his autobiography, is full of stuff about the difference between um, push spin, as it then was, pinball, and poetry, higher choices, lower choices, higher cells, lower cells. And his notion of individualism is that we should be constantly seeking to improve ourselves, to educate ourselves, to become more moral. And that comes from reading books. It comes from talking to clever, interesting people, go to concerts and all of that sort of stuff. But it also comes from participating in society, in experiments in living. So the individual is a project. It's the individual is something that is constantly being improved. And I actually think that Isaiah Berlin, a great man, and what he said about pluralism was absolutely right. But in his two essays, in his work on liberty, in his distinction between positive and negative liberty, he's slightly he's led us down the wrong path. I mean, he says basically people who talk about positive liberty. He says liberty basically is negative. It's freedom from interference by others, and I don't think that's enough. I think liberty is also about being able to achieve higher ends, so being given public education or being given a public a public health service. And the distinction between liberalism and collectivism is that the liberal reason for doing all of that interfering is to make the individual more empowered. Whereas the socialists said they want to put the individual into a sort of collectivist frame, they want to achieve collectivist ends. Individualism always justifies interference on the grounds of individual self-improvement, perfection, achieving their ends. So I think
Yeah,
I was wrong there.
yes. Well, I think I probably slightly disagree with you, which I think it was right to make the distinction between negative and positive liberty. And Amartya Sen talks about
Hmm.
capabilities to
Yeah.
improve positive liberty. But I think it's not a replacement of positive and negative liberty. It's an addition to it. And you're talking almost like a moral liberalism and a
Hmm.
amoral liberalism, which is associated with this sort of social liberalism of the kind of Blairite era. You want to
Yeah,
sort of
absolutely.
beyond that. So I would say it was both. Let's move now to wealth and
Yes.
the liberal elite sort of doing all they can to justify their position in society, but then hold on to those riches
Yeah.
and the status and the power for their own children. And that requires, doesn't it, a much more radical prospectus than we have at the moment in terms of policy. And we at Bright Blue have pushed for this very strongly. We've said, actually, in today's economy, if you want to achieve real economic security and mobility, you need assets. You don't just need
Yes.
income. Income alone, even if you're on a high income, is never really going to drive social mobility for you. People have talked about an inheritocracy, for example,
Hmm.
in housing. And lots of people in London and South East, as you know, are priced out of the housing market because of the high deposit that is required, and even people on very high incomes over 100K are struggling to get on the housing ladder in those
Sure.
areas. So how do we do that? Some people talk about lotteries in state schools rather than catchment areas because middle class people monopolize
Mhm.
certain areas where good schools are. People like Sandel have talked about even lotteries in universities. So as long as you get the basic grades, that's the meritocratic
Meritocratic. Yeah.
meritocratic bit. As long as you get the necessary grades, then there's a lottery above and beyond that. Um, Private schools, obviously the Labour government have removed the exemption on VAT. People talk about removing the charitable status. Inheritance tax. Labour made some attempts just to remove or reduce some of the reliefs on
Hmm.
agricultural property and business property relief. But people like Adam Smith, for example, were big proponents of increased inheritance tax.
Absolutely.
But some people, some of that list that I've given there, some people would say, well, that's undermining my individual liberty and what I
Yes.
built, and it's
Yes.
undermining my freedom. But really, if we're going to break up that elite and make it more competitive, we do need to think of more about those more radical ideas.
Absolutely. Absolutely. One of the heroes of my book is Teddy Roosevelt, who is not sort of temperamentally a liberal, but he is functionally a liberal. And what he says is that in the late 19th century, America was creating fortunes which were so large that they were going to cascade down the generations. And that would be bad in two ways. One is that it would create one is that it would restrict the notion of equality of opportunity, which was the foundational principle of the United States, a foundational principle. And secondly, that it would create an inherited aristocracy, a very un-American thing, that would be decadent. And he says, the best way to prevent the upper classes from becoming decadent is to force them into open competition. In other words, to take away some of their money. And I think both of those things are true. I think it's bad for people who inherit vast fortunes to be able to sail through life without effort, and it's definitely bad for the tenor of society. However, there is the question of how far you take this. So it's very easy for me to say, let the Rockefellers have their money taken away from them because that would make them decadent. Well, what about me and my children, and my ability to pass on my houses? So how far do you go? I am I'm in the my prejudices are towards radicalism, towards thinking that we have to sacrifice one liberal principle, which is private property and your ability to transmit your property to your children, to another liberal principle, which is equality of opportunity. And that's my generation in particular has been the beneficiary of a property price inflation, which is creating massive wealth distortions, which are going to be perpetuated down the generations. And I see people of my children's age inheriting or acquiring houses in London because their parents have bought them for them, who don't have to work anymore. They can just live off the rents. They can become a rentier class. That is not good for culture, and that is not good for society. And I think there's a significant number of people who are going to live that life, got a house, live in London, and don't really need to do anything because they've got an income coming from their poor friends who have to work for the civil service. However, I think that a more important thing is to improve opportunities for upward mobility. And I think the way to do that, it's quite predictable that I'll say this, is through meritocracy, is through early intervention to secure equality of opportunity, gifted programs to make sure that talented young children have from underprivileged backgrounds have more opportunities, using objective tests like IQ tests to identify talent wherever it occurs in society, having academically specialized schools, but also having academically rigorous schools and focusing on finding talent and developing it. And I recently went to, Catherine Birbal Singh's school, Michaela, and I was just so impressed by the way that if you have a school that has an academic ethos, that puts an emphasis on um, discipline, academic knowledge, but also assimilating people into a common culture, you can create a system which is extraordinarily productive, both as an academic agency, but also as an agency of cultural assimilation. So I think the bigger problem than the giant fortunes, which is a problem, is the fact that we don't have an educational system dedicated to academic excellence, meritocracy, and assimilation.
Yes, I agree with a lot of that, not everything. Certainly on too much inheritance, if there's too much cascading of wealth down the generations, there is some evidence around that being bad for work ethic and the
Yeah,
number um, new companies being formed as
yeah,
well.
yeah,
You inherit that sort of level of wealth, then you're less likely to be productive in that sense, which is bad. It has wider
yeah,
public consequences. Certainly agree the earlier the better. And actually, a lot of the childcare policy that we have, or early years policy in this country, seems to be more directed towards reducing the cost for parents, which is important, of course.
It's all
So
labour market driven.
it's
It's
all
not,
labour market driven
yeah.
rather than actually,
Mhm.
the good quality early years, is correlated with much better outcomes, not being overly deterministic about it, but, you can see right from the age of 4 or 5, if you're much more likely to be in the top quintile, 20 years later. So
Sure.
I think we need to be thinking about how we invest much more money in raising the status and quality of preschool education as the most
Totally.
important part of the
Absolutely.
education system,
Absolutely.
and
Absolutely.
also thinking about making it compulsory for a certain number of hours when we
Yeah.
get to that
Yeah.
stage where it's universally accessible. Interesting that you mentioned the Michaela School, because it isn't a selective school. It's not a grammar school. And I think the evidence on grammar schools, I would say, is that it is not great for social mobility for a wider group of people. And in
But
fact,
that's not an argument against selective schools. That's an argument about the way that these grammar schools are operating their selection systems. I mean, I think they tend to be middle class schools in middle class areas which are biased towards selecting middle class pupils. I think if you made the selection process much more rigorous, you could change the composition. But also, I wanted to add to that, what we hadn't brought into that is the issue of the public schools, the private schools, which again I think should be not brought into the state system, because that would be too intrusive on individual liberty. But instead of trying to squeeze them out of existence, lots of them out of existence, you should be providing scholarships, free places on the basis of, again, of academic ability. And one of the elements I talked about, this liberal synthesis of, the social liberals and the economic liberals. But one thing that's sort of pervasive in both groups is a belief, is an opposition to any notion of human inequality and innate abilities. That notion that there are innate abilities, which are randomly distributed in the population and which we need to do our best to try and capture, is something that was central to early 20th century liberalism, because because people could see that there are lots and lots of clever people in the working classes who weren't being educated, and they thought that you need to create a proper capacity catching machine to get them. That's something that's disappeared from contemporary liberalism under the influence of left-wing egalitarian thought, but also right-wing notion that all that matters is creating market mechanisms that work effectively. Because Hayek
so a few,
hated the notion of meritocracy.
yeah, so a few things just to reflect on that. So the assisted places scheme that
Yeah,
was in place until 1997,
yeah,
what happened is with that, and part of the reason that it was taken out was because a lot of divorced parents
interesting. Yeah,
who then became low income and then monopolized the
right,
places.
right.
So it wasn't a great engine of social mobility, the assisted places scheme. But if it was designed in a better way, maybe
Yes,
it would be. But it's
yes.
interesting with maintenance grants as well, because what happens there is often a lot of children of broadly wealthy parents who have divorced get
That's
maintenance
interesting.
grants
Yes,
because they
yes,
claim it
yes,
under the
yes,
one of the parents who is a low income.
yes. But I mean, I think that
So there's that. Grammar schools, even when we had a lot of grammar schools, the evidence seems to suggest that in non-selective places, people from poorer backgrounds did better on average in aggregate than they did in selective areas, even when there was mass grammar school system. And then finally, what I would say is the role of private schools.
mm,
You talk about bursaries and scholarships, which, if designed better, could be helpful. I think social integration is really important, and connectivity between people with different backgrounds. So I think there should be conditions on private schools to do, I don't know, shared sports days or shared
I agree with that.
shared
Yeah,
programs with
yeah,
state schools. Because actually, there's a lot of evidence that mixedness is quite important for long-term outcomes. So the
mm,
work of Raj Chetty
yeah, yeah,
at
yeah,
Harvard
sure.
University found that, interestingly, in childhood, your Facebook friends, if you have more Facebook friends who are from wealthier backgrounds and you're from a low income background, you are much more likely to experience long haul social mobility. And it's a factor which is as strong as family stability, education,
Interesting.
qualifications. So I think there's something about social mixedness and being exposed to people from wealthier backgrounds and the information you get, the learning about behaviors, etc., which is really important too.
I mean, I abhor this government's policy towards private schools because I think it's mean-minded, it's small, it's not raising very much money. And what I want to have is an educational system which has a variety of different providers and more pluralism. But I do think that these private schools during the glory years behaved appallingly. They jacked up their fees, they increased the number of foreigners they had absolutely hugely, and they forgot that they were originally set up to provide education for the poor. I mean, Eton and Winchester definitely were local poor people, not local. I mean, just poorer people were supposed to be getting scholarships so they could be trained for the church and the state, and that lack of social responsibility has doomed them. And I think Eton in particular, but also Winchester to some extent, has recovered that. But a lot of these middle range public schools were very short sighted and broke the social contract they had with society.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with that. And to be honest, even before the VAT was imposed, the fees were sky high.
Sky high, absolutely,
Um,
absolutely.
Taking
Yeah,
out many parents from middle class, stable middle class
yeah.
jobs, doctors. A lot of people I know now who um, send their children to private school are, top lawyers or
Oh,
bankers
absolutely.
or VCs. They're not you're not the sort of middle class of the past of teachers and
Absolutely. If you have a world in which Daily Telegraph editorial writers couldn't possibly afford to send their children to private schools, your constituency is contracting to a dangerous degree, I think.
and
They
one last
price
question
themselves
I
out of
have.
the market.
One last question I have before we open it up, which is we talked a lot about America, and
Yeah,
the greatest president for me was Theodore Roosevelt, and actually part of the influence for the name of my first son. But let's move to Germany,
very
which
good.
has also been quite a big
Yeah,
influence on my politics. And you talk a lot about the Ordo liberals, which I find have sort of gone out of fashion, but were really responsible for the kind of economic boom in post-war West Germany. Um, and they describe themselves, I would say, as pro-market rather than free market. They thought
yes,
there was a role for government in setting strong rules and laws to ensure that cartels and monopolies weren't formed,
exactly.
had
Yeah.
very good competition. So just talk through what you think about the Ordo liberals and what we can learn from them in today's politics.
Sure. Well, the Ordo liberals come along after the Second World War and play a central role in the reconstruction of Germany after the Second World War and the transformation of a country that had been bombed to pieces into the powerhouse that it became very quickly after the war. And as you say, they're pro-market, not free market. And they believe that you need to value cultural traditions very highly. They're very conservative culturally in that sense. So that people are having educated preferences, not just preferences, as I said about in the marketplace. So there's a break with Hayek about the role of culture. But more importantly, I think they believe that for a market society to operate, you need to break up cartels. And you need to have an active antitrust policy which breaks up big conglomerations of power and which prevents industrial conglomerates from having too close a relationship with powerful people. Because what happened in Germany before the First World War and also before the Second World War is a very concentrated form of capitalism, which is also intertwined with the state. Right at the top. You've always got the middle stand companies, but right at the top you have that. And what they say, we must get rid of these conglomerations, we must break them up, and rely much more on the middle stand as being the sort of defining German characteristic. So Germany becomes identified not as a conglomerate country, but as a country of very diversified, very highly dispersed companies. And I think both of these ideas, this idea of cultural tradition, as something that that government should actively try and preserve and of breaking up the conglomerates is much more relevant now than at any time since the auto liberals were operating, because we do have a conglomeratization, certainly in the most advanced sectors of the economy, and we have seen what happens when we just allow culture to be shaped entirely by the market, and without any sense of a sort of elitist culture being preserved by society. So they're an extremely interesting group of people, and I would think that they have more promise for our current era than Hayek. So it's really the German school rather than the Austrian school that I think we should be thinking about at the moment.
Totally agree. Totally agree. And you're right about power. You said earlier about the need to contest, to separate powers.
Yeah,
Karl Popper, the great liberal philosopher as well, was sort of, very big on that. The biggest enemy really is power, and
exactly.
sure that we
Exactly.
stand up to that and separate it. Okay, well, I've got about 10 minutes left, so I want
Yeah.
to, you and I could probably talk all day, but
We
let's
could
let's
indeed, easily. Yeah.
let's open it up to some questions. So, just to remind people watching, you can ask questions through the Slido link just below the YouTube channel that you are watching. So, the first question is from an anonymous person who I think may be from Prosper UK, because they say, what should groups like Prosper UK be doing to encourage and enable a new generation to rethink liberalism? And I think Prosper UK is the sort
Yes.
of
Yeah.
group that, Andy Street, Ruth Davidson have set up.
I think have the courage to break with certain shibboleths of the liberalism that were taken for granted in your generation. So I would say I would love to have something responsible and interesting said about immigration from the center. We have all the stuff from the left, from the Greens, saying, any attack on any criticism of the status quo is racism. We have the stuff, very familiar stuff, coming from Matt Goodwin and those people saying, the country is going to hell in a handbasket. But a liberal case for immigration reform is the most important thing we could say, which would admit to a number of problems and say that addressing those problems, parallel societies, grooming gangs, lack of assimilation in certain areas, is central. That there is a liberal case for saying that we mustn't have racial intolerance coming from minority groups or from majority groups, any groups, that we mustn't have current cousin marriage, that we mustn't have, um, as I say, parallel societies or political parties that don't allow women to sit next to men in political meetings and things like that. A criticism from people who are identified with the current establishment on the grounds of making immigration better, and assimilation better, I think would be something which would make us look at those people again. Because I think a lot of people who are tempted by the right and the left think that the establishment has simply dodged that problem.
Yeah, I mean, we at Bright Blue have been talking about both for the welfare and the immigration system
Sure.
being based on a contributory based system. So people who
Yeah.
contribute more economically, but also socially, should be let in, but also rewarded. So, for example, the current Home Secretary recently adopted one of our ideas, which is people who have volunteered more in the community should be able to accelerate their route to
Yeah.
settlement. It's not just about how much you earn. So,
Yes.
and with the welfare system, it's very, compared to other European countries, it's very needs based in this country. You're not really rewarded for
Yeah. Yeah.
how many years that you've worked. And, whether it's on universal credit or maternity pay, paternity pay, I think there should be a contribution element, which is if you've worked longer, you should get more out of the system. So we'd like to see that from a kind of liberal centrist
I like
perspective.
that. The other thing I'd like to see coming from the centrists, and I don't want to just project onto them my own preoccupations, but I think some sort of and Ruth Davidson would be a good person to articulate this case, some sort of awareness of the degree of threat that's coming from the axis of authoritarianism, particularly Russia. And I think we need to move towards a system of some sort of conscription or some sort of military service. We definitely need to be increasing the rate at which we're increasing military spending. And again, for the centre to be saying things which are sort of challenging to the easy individualistic consensus, I'd like to see. So a communitarian sort of approach to things. I just don't see anybody actually emphasizing the importance of our military threat. And again, if they want to identify themselves, distinguish themselves from the mushy middle, from people like Ed Davey who never say anything of any interest about anything, challenging these difficult issues. Why are we not assimilating significant chunks of the population? What are we doing to prepare for the fact that we're in a sort of no man's land between war and peace? Would be where I would think that they would get the maximum response.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because the Tories, obviously, in their last manifesto, talked about compulsory national service, and it was a
Which they
mix.
brought in at the very last second. This sort
Yeah,
of
and
this
to be honest,
rabbit produced from the hat with no preparation. It was terrible
no
that they did
progression, but it had elements that were good. I
that. Oh,
mean,
absolutely,
mandatory
absolutely,
volunteering at age 18 would be incredibly
totally,
difficult and
totally,
burden on
totally.
employers. But a kind of highly selective group of people who are selected to do military service, and it's something that is very desirable. Great for your CV.
Yeah.
They have this in Europe, so a
Well, in
highly
Sweden, Sweden has
yeah,
exactly that.
highly
Yeah,
elitist model, I
yeah.
think would be good for the military, but it's also good for
Yeah.
those people. And I agree that we should be looking at that. But what was in the Tory manifesto, I think, was a little bit rushed and not thought through
It's
enough.
a last moment notion. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Finally, a question here that I've got from an anonymous person again is how do you square your call for a restated radical liberalism with how the UK's political parties seem remarkably closed to these ideas?
I think our political party structure is in the most terrible trouble at the moment. You have a Labour Party which is governed by ideological and sectional interests, um, which, from identity groups or NGOs or public sector workers, seem to control that party. And it's a party that intellectually, as far as I can see, since the last election, they had a massive opportunity with all the time that the Tories were uh, dying to produce an agenda, and they failed to do that. The Tory party has been falling apart for a very, very long time, um, and is only very slowly getting back on its feet. Partly because it's gone through a sort of collective nervous breakdown since Brexit, and its selection of candidates is very lackluster and very mechanical. There's no attempt to reach out to new generations of people or excite new generations of people. And the Liberal Party, the Liberal Democrats, is a complete and utter waste of space. Ed Davey had a massive opportunity to create a dynamic party in the centre and chose just to dance around and make silly gestures rather than becoming a hotbed of new ideas and new thinking. So the political system is very bad, which is why so many people, young people, are going to the Greens. And I think why so many young people, young, intelligent, interesting people are attracted to reform. We tend to think of reform as an old person's party. We think of Nigel Farage, but I keep coming across young people who are excited by post-liberalism, who are excited by a challenge to the status quo, and who are moving in sort of MAGA-like sort of circles. And they're not doing it because they're malicious, bad people, but because they are totally frustrated by the current status quo and are very, very excited by rethinking basic ideas. So we need, as I say, to re-energize the centre intellectually, but we need to open up the centre to new people. I don't see any party really developing a sort of a sane, bright, interesting youth wing.
Yeah, really interesting. Which brings me to the final question, which is from Will Pickering, who has said, you talked a lot about new leaders. Why are liberal centrists still led by prominent elder statespeople like Tony Blair? Um, Surely it's time for them to let go and support the next generation.
It's an absolutely great question, and I think whenever I see certain people from my generation or older, putting their heads yet again above the barricade and making great pronouncements, I shudder, because it is time. They are implicated in too many problems. They have been around for too long, and they are intellectually closed. So I think it is time for a new generation to arise. And I hope that that is beginning to happen. One example I would say is the new mayor of San Francisco, who is a progressive centrist. And he basically said, look, I'm a progressive just like you are, but being a progressive cannot mean just allowing people to shoot up heroin in the street and live in the street. It can't mean tolerating vast, housing, shanty towns in the middle of a modern city. So you are getting all around the world younger people, new voices coming along. Not enough, but I hope that one of the things that we will do, you, I, collectively, people who care about liberal reform, is to put the spotlight on new people. And perhaps if we can also drag the spotlight away from Tony Blair and David Cameron and the rest of them, that would be an added bonus.
Well, that's certainly what we're trying to do at Bright Blue and be a home for people who, want that more liberal conservative vision, which I think
Yes.
is what you're calling for. So, Adrian, that's been great. So, thank you so much for your time and thoughts. We're very grateful for it. Thank you to everybody watching from home. A kind of virtual round of applause for Adrian.
Thank you very much.
But I hope everyone has a good rest of the day, and we'll be announcing our next Ludgate lecture, which is with Professor Rob Ford from the University of
Ah,
Manchester, who will be
very
talking
well.
about the local elections, just after the local elections, and what it means for our party system, which Adrian has just critiqued there. So watch out for that. But thank you, everyone.